Thanks to Mona for hosting me for this talk, and to you all for coming here today. We're going to be kind of moving through the gallery in a little bit of a non-traditional way through the eyes of a historian, which does tend to think about things still kind of chronologically here. But I wanted us to start in this space, which is kind of an introduction to the exhibit, to think big picture about what this conversation is about, which is what does it mean to be a Nebraskan? How do we define being a Nebraskan? Who do we consider to be a Nebraska artist and fitting within the kind of scope of the mission of the Museum of Nebraska Art? And that's kind of a existential and theoretical question. I thought I'd begin by just asking, show of hands, how many of you all consider yourselves to be Nebraskan? Most folks, but not everyone. So those of you who raised your hand and said you are a Nebraskan, can I get a couple volunteers? Why are you a Nebraskan?
I was born here, and I live here.
Born here?
Born here.
Born here? How many were born here? Decent number. All right. You raised your hand, but you're not born here, so why are you a Nebraskan?
Because my family came from here. My parents were both born here.
Okay. So you weren't born here, but your family.
And they sent me back.
Okay. Anyone else have a different reason for being Nebraskan? Anybody have another reason they would consider themselves Nebraskan other than being born here? Yeah.
I guess sometimes I think I identify with the geography of the place. I mean,
Okay.
I go to different places and I like them and I enjoy them, but somehow I feel like I belong here.
Okay. So a feeling of belonging, and it's attached to the physical place, like the way it looks, the landscape, kind of?
I mean, when people say they find the sand hills to be boring, I don't. I think it's just a different kind of view.
Yeah, right.
Okay. So birth, appreciation of the beauty of the place. Anybody not consider themselves a Nebraskan here? Yeah.
I don't consider myself totally a Nebraskan.
Okay.
Partly, but also Kansan.
Also a Kansan. Okay. So why do you not consider yourself totally a Nebraskan?
Because having been born in Kansas and lived there a long time.
Okay. So you kind of identify with both.
Yeah.
You're Kansan and Nebraskan. Okay.
They're both prairie states.
Sure. Similar.
Yeah,
All right.
Sandy said.
All right. So we'll flip that script around. I'm from Florida. I was born and raised in Tallahassee, Florida. I grew up there. My family runs back 6 generations there. I lived there until I was about 21 years of age. I went to Florida State University. I moved to Arizona for graduate school, and I lived there for 3 or 4 years, where I went to Arizona State University for my doctorate. And then back to Florida for a little bit and came to Nebraska, taking up residence here in Kearney in 2014. When I took over what was in the Frank House, now the Frank Museum, over on the university campus. I was director of the Frank Museum for 5 years. I bounced over to Georgia for 9 months, and then UNK brought me back to become faculty in the history department, where I have been faculty now for about 5 years. So you all are now the jury. Am I a Nebraskan?
Yeah. We welcome
Yeah?
you as a Nebraskan.
You welcomed me. Why am I a Nebraskan?
Because we like you here.
All right, that's a good point. You like me, so I'm allowed to be a Nebraskan.
But it's not for everyone, you know.
All right. Yeah.
You're nice.
I'm nice. I'm Nebraska nice. Sure. All right. Would anybody say I'm not a Nebraskan? Oh, that's very kind of you.
At the Frank Museum, though, you really immersed your whole life
Okay.
into that.
So because I've committed myself to Nebraska, I'm a Nebraskan.
Well, you know so many of the Nebraska stories and understand so much and are willing to share those Nebraska stories.
Okay. So because I'm a historian who does research on Nebraska and lives in Nebraska, right?
You involved yourself in the town. We saw you other places.
I'm involved in the community. Yep. I pay taxes here. I work at your university. I teach your children. I married a Nebraskan on the banks of the Platte River. I feel like that counts, right? I feel like that kind of counts, right?
And your yard counts.
There we go. I have a yard full of native Nebraska plants. But I'm also a Floridian, right?
Oh, yeah.
I would still consider myself both. At what point did I become Nebraskan? Was it when I drove the U-Haul into the state? Was it when you all decided I was part of the community? Did you get to determine when I was a Nebraskan? Did I get to decide? Yeah. In my heart. I got to decide. Right. So what I'm trying to get at here is these are kind of subjective things. We think, on face value, being a Nebraskan, okay, you born or live in Nebraska. But you all said that I didn't necessarily become a Nebraskan when the U-Haul drove into the state and I took a job here. Something else had to happen for me to become Nebraskan, right? To feel that I was Nebraskan and for others to consider me to be Nebraskan. So it's a little bit more subjective than as simple as I was born here, or I moved here, or I lived here for a little while. I would consider myself Floridian. I would consider myself Nebraskan. I lived in Arizona for 3 or 4 years. I don't really consider myself an Arizonan. I was just there for college, right? So these are subjective things to a certain extent. They're things that we get to define for ourselves, but in a place like the Museum of Nebraska Art, it's something that the museum defines for other people, deciding who is and is not a Nebraskan and belongs in the permanent collection of the Museum of Nebraska Art. And it's a little tricky when you're starting to think about telling somebody else whether or not they are a Nebraskan, right? Because I can feel one way and you might feel differently, right? So that's what I want us to be thinking about today, how the museum itself has defined being a Nebraskan over time, and also how we might define this idea, and how this concept has evolved over the history of this place. How being a Nebraskan, who is and is not a Nebraskan, has evolved over time. A lot of the idea that I'm borrowing for this talk, and we're going to move into another room in just a second here, comes from a social scientist by the name of Benedict Anderson, who wrote a book about 40 or 50 years ago called Imagined Communities, which is about nation states primarily, not about individual states or regions. It's primarily about nations, but he argues that nations are in a sense an imagined thing. They're something that we create. We as humans establish borders. We decide on a cultural identity for a place. We decide on what makes a place, the identity that brings us all together. And so to a certain extent, our nations are creations of ourselves. They're cultural constructs, we would call them as historians. They're creations of the human mind. And we could argue Nebraska is in some sense the same. And so we're going to kind of explore that concept here and look at how that's reflected in the art. And the first place we're going to go is around the corner to the native art section. So we're going to start here with this concept, this discussion of what does it mean to be a Nebraskan with what we might argue are the first Nebraskans, the indigenous peoples who lived in this region for generations before Euro-American settlers arrived, right? And Nebraska, or the place we now call Nebraska, this geographical space, was home to and is home to several different native communities, the Pawnee, the Ponca, the Otoe-Missouri, right? The Lakota, the Arapaho, the Cheyenne. Lots of communities call this place an ancestral home and considered this place an ancestral home, again, long before Euro-Americans arrived. And in many instances today, we would consider native peoples to be Nebraskan, but part of the complicated nature of all of this is that Nebraska doesn't exist as a thing prior to the 1800s. They would not have considered themselves Nebraskan because that concept didn't exist. The word Nebraska sort of existed. It comes from an Otoe or Omaha word for flat water, which is a description for the Platte River. It's not a geographical like border. It's a river. The Platte River is actually, the word Platte comes from the French term for the river, right? There's a lot of cultural mingling going on here in the state early on, right? But the peoples who lived here for generations before the arrival of Euro-American settlers would not have necessarily considered themselves Nebraskan, but we can retroactively consider them to be so, in particular because many of those people, the descendants of those people, still live in Nebraska today, right? And they continue to create art as their ancestors created art long before Euro-Americans arrived, right? And we see some of that represented here in this space. Behind me, we have moccasins and a dress, both of which are Lakota, made with beadwork, right? An expression of a person's artistic and cultural beliefs, right? Traditional form of artwork practiced before Euro-Americans arrived and practiced still today. These are more modern iterations created in the 1900s, right? And then behind me over here, we have a hide painting by Al Chandler Goodstrike, a buffalo hide painting, right? Which is again a common form of cultural and artistic expression among some indigenous communities in this region, although this is a more modern manifestation, right? Many of the indigenous nations who called this place home recorded things like their winter counts on buffalo hides, right? Recording the most significant event of each year, 1 year after the next, on a hide to document the history of their community, of their family group, right? And to pass that history down from generation to generation, right? So art is being created in Nebraska before Nebraska exists as a concept, right? And we might still consider to be Nebraskan, right? And art continues to be created by indigenous peoples who live in Nebraska or who trace their ancestral home to Nebraska today, right? And that art is oftentimes an adaptation to colonialism, which we see really beautifully manifested over here with Dwayne Wilcox's ledger art, right? So this beautiful ledger art piece 100 miles north of the Sandhills, right? Ledger paper was something that was really commonly available in the reservation era in the late 1800s and in the early 1900s. This is government document paper that was sent to government agencies, right? Agencies that served the reservations and theoretically provided Native peoples with food and annuity payments, although that often didn't arrive as promised. And that ledger paper would be reused by Native people to create art that often spoke to and critiqued the colonialism that they were experiencing, right? Really creative adaptations and reuses of the tools of colonialism to challenge colonialism, right? Dwayne Wilcox is a modern artist, Lakota artist, that continues to express those kinds of critiques through his work, right? So we have a very complicated understanding here already emerging of like who is a Nebraskan, right? The Museum of Nebraska Art didn't collect its first piece of Native American art for 15 years after its establishment, right? So we don't necessarily, even in this museum's history, define Native peoples as being part of Nebraska art for a decade or more after the museum is established. It took time for the museum to start collecting pieces created by Native Nebraska artists. And then we have a complicated discussion around, do they have to live in Nebraska to be a Nebraskan artist? Because of course indigenous peoples, many were forcibly removed from the state, but still trace their ancestral home to this place. And so maybe creating art down in Oklahoma, but be a member of the Oto-Missouria, who traditionally lived in southeastern Nebraska, what is now southeastern Nebraska, right? So these are complicated questions, right? Now, in our traditional story of Nebraska history, we often move from Native peoples being here, and to be fair, we oftentimes make the mistake of referring to Native peoples only in the past tense as having been here, not as also still presently here. That's an important linguistic thing we need to be mindful of. But we often move from Native peoples living in this place, about a dozen or so different Native tribal communities, either as permanent full-time residents like the Pawnee living in farming villages, or as people who hunted and had kind of traditional hunting grounds in what is now the state of Nebraska, to the wagon trains in the 1800s. And that's kind of what's actually represented here, but we're skipping a really important and interesting period in Nebraska's history, and another way to kind of make this idea of who is a Nebraskan a little bit more complex, because the first European Americans to set foot in what is now Nebraska were not Americans. They were not English speakers. They were French, and they were Spanish. The first European languages spoken in the state of Nebraska would not have been English, right? They would have been French and Spanish. French fur traders, Spanish explorers, right? For a while, historians thought that the first Europeans to arrive in what is now Nebraska would have been the Coronado expedition in 1541, 1542. That's Francisco Coronado, who was taking a contingent of, he was a Spanish conquistador, taking a military contingent of Spanish men, along with some Puebloan allies, up through what is now kind of like the Lubbock, Texas, and Kansas region in search of Quivira, which was supposed to be this lost city of gold. We now know, based on better interpretation of the records and archaeological evidence, that he probably made it no further than kind of the Flint Hills of Kansas, Salida region, and that Quivira is what he was using to refer to the Wichita people who lived in that region. So he didn't make it quite all the way to what is now Nebraska. But by the late 1600s, Nebraska was claimed by, what is now Nebraska was claimed by the French, right? It was part of French Louisiana, and was within their fur trading realm. And so you see French fur traders coming into the region. In 1720, we see another attempt by the Spanish to reach into this part of what we now call the Great Plains with what's called the Villa Sur expedition, led by a man named Pedro de Villa Sur, hence the name for the expedition. Villa Sur, along with about 40 or so Spanish soldiers and some Puebloan allies from New Mexico, made their way up to Nebraska to contest the French claims to this space, to try to claim this space for Spain and to try to be able to trade with the native populations that were here. When Villacur arrived in Nebraska, he crossed over the Republican River, he crossed over the Platte River, and he ended up going about as far as what is now Columbus, Nebraska, along the loop, where in August, I think it's August 13th of 1720, his enslaved Pawnee translator, interpreter, tried to, on his behalf, create some connections between him and his expedition and the Pawnee who were living in that region, and then disappeared in the middle of the night. And the next morning, on August 14th of 1720, the Spanish were awoken by an attack from Pawnee and Oto warriors that basically wiped out the expedition, killed Villacur, killed 36 out of the 40 Spaniards, along with a number of their Puebloan allies, and so 4 Spanish men and a handful of Puebloan peoples limped their way back to New Mexico. Big battle right outside of Columbus. And it also results in what I've folded up here, which is this piece of art that is not in the collection of the Museum of Nebraska Art, but I do want to still call attention to, which is the Stoutamire hide. So this is considered to be the oldest extant painting of an event happening in Nebraska. So this is, and I'll pass it around, this is just a small excerpt of it. It's a hide painting like this, but created in New Mexico, most likely by an indigenous artist in New Mexico, and depicting the battle that happened outside of Columbus and the death of Villacur and most of his Spanish men, right? So is this a piece of Nebraska art? It's created depicting an event that happened in Nebraska, a clash between the Spanish and the Pawnee, right? But created by an indigenous artist in New Mexico. It's a little all over the place, right? And it's now at the Palace of Governors in New Mexico. And it's in Santa Fe if you want to go see it.
Can it be stolen? Can it be stolen?
Can it be stolen? I'm not going to say that on video. It's called the Stoutamire hide after the Swedish kind of elite nobleman who acquired the painting at one point, right? One of the fun facts about that is it actually depicts French forces being present and participating in the battle. And there's a lot of debate over this, but very likely there were no French forces there. It's that the Spanish couldn't conceive that they could possibly be beaten so soundly by just native forces. So they had to add some French to make it look less bad that they had been beaten so badly, right? So that's 1720, right? We have French and Spanish speakers in what is now Nebraska. We have the oldest extant piece of painting of Nebraska, right? So these are, again, complicated questions. Nebraska is going to become part of the United States, of course, with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, right? When the U.S. acquires this whole region of the Great Plains from, at least on paper, from the French, from Napoleon, for a relatively reasonable sum in the time, right? And greatly expands the size of the U.S. But what is this area called? What is the territory we're sitting in right now? Anybody know what it's called in the early 1800s? It's still not called Nebraska. Great American Desert's a nickname for it, yeah. On maps, anybody know what it's called? Unorganized territory. We're still undefined, right?
That was a trick question.
It's just called unorganized territory, right? It is unclear to Americans what is out here. There are, of course, again, all sorts of native nations living out here and still creating art and having thriving lives, right? But from an American perspective, it is unorganized territory. Nebraska still doesn't exist, right? And so the first thing the American government's going to do is start sending military expeditions out into the Great Plains and out into the further western regions, into the Rocky Mountains eventually as well, to try to better understand this region, try to better understand this place, right? And so they're going to come out and they're going to document the flora and the fauna. They're going to collect samples of the native plants that are growing and the bugs and those sorts of things. They're going to map the region and they're going to document its indigenous peoples. And there's already kind of a mindset forming in the eyes of many of these folks in this time that those indigenous peoples need to be documented because they will eventually naturally go extinct, pass away, disappear. That's kind of the idea of the vanishing Indian is the popular concept in this time period, that indigenous peoples will eventually disappear and need to be documented by anthropologists and others before that happens. So we don't have on display in here at the moment any art from those expeditions, although I know Mona does have some of that material in their collections. But this piece behind you all right here by Jules Tavernier is a good kind of approximation of that. It's a little bit later, it's from the 1870s. But again, Tavernier is born in Paris, right? He's born in Paris, he spends a couple years in Nebraska, about 1874-75, spends some time at what is Fort Robinson, and the Red Cloud Agency, up in the Pine Ridge, right? And creates some depictions of, kind of romanticized depictions of Nebraska. And we consider that to be Nebraska art, even though he's a Parisian-born artist who briefly checked out the state, what is now the state of Nebraska. Of course, again, that's a complicated definition. So we have these expeditions that come through that try to document the region, try to kind of create this image of an untamed West that needs kind of settlement, that needs white folks in particular to come in and cultivate it and turn it into manageable and productive land. That's also an image that's kind of being projected by a lot of this art as well. So now who can tell me when Nebraska actually shows up on a map? Does anyone know? Any guesses? It's in the name of the law that made it exist. Kansas-Nebraska Act. Right. So this region is acquired by the United States in 1803, but it is unorganized territory. And when those expeditions, those government-funded expeditions are coming through, whether that's Lewis and Clark or Stephen Long or Zebulon Pike or John C. Fremont, or you can name those folks, they're coming through what they consider to be unorganized territory. They don't think of this place as Nebraska. And when the first wagon trains start coming through in the 1840s, on their way further west, in most instances, right, in search of gold in California in 1849, right, in search of religious freedom in Utah for the Mormons that are coming through, right, in search of quote-unquote free land in places like Oregon, right, they don't think of this place as Nebraska either because that name doesn't yet exist on a map. But they're documenting, they're drawing, they're creating artistic depictions of who's here, right? And we consider some of them to be, involved in Nebraska art in one way or another, right? Nebraska doesn't become part of the map until 1854. And I want us to kind of look at these depictions behind us over here from from Thomas Hart Benton in support of Francis Parkman's Oregon Trail. So in the late 1840s, a guy by the name of Francis Parkman comes through along the Overland Trail, and he is notable because he is sort of a historian. He's one of the earlier kind of described as historians in the United States, although what he is documenting is his lived experience. He's documenting the experience of traveling over the Oregon Trail, and he publishes that as a book in 1848, 1849. That book becomes a nationwide bestseller. It informs Americans about what it is like to travel along the trail, about what it is like, in his mind at least, to encounter the native peoples who live here, the hardships of the weather, those sorts of things are all documented by Francis Parkman. It becomes a wildly best-selling book. And it's reprinted and reprinted and reprinted and reprinted over time. It really helps to inform the kind of mythos of the American West in the American consciousness for at least a century or so. It is kind of one of the default books on the history of westward migration and settlement. And about a century later, Thomas Hart Benton creates these beautiful renditions, these regionalist-style artworks, to accompany a reprinting of Francis Parkman's Oregon Trail book, right? So this is a 1950s-ish reinterpretation of Francis Parkman's much older text and accompanying a republication of the book for American audiences to read. It's beautiful art, depicts Nebraska through a particular lens for sure, kind of this, again, untamed Wild West image that had been popular for so very long. But again, as we were talking about, Nebraska in 1848 still doesn't exist yet. Nebraska in 1848, what we now call Nebraska, is still unorganized territory. Francis Parkman is not traveling through Nebraska in his mind, he is traveling through unorganized territory. But we consider this to be art depicting life in Nebraska. Complicated. So Nebraska becomes a thing on the map in 1854 with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act is passed, like a lot of legislation in the 1850s, because of slavery. So Nebraska is actually birthed out of the debate over slavery in the United States. We don't typically think of ourselves that way, but that is actually where the idea, the concept of Nebraska comes from, right? There's heated debates in Washington, D.C. and across the country over whether or not slavery should be allowed to continue to expand, let alone exist at all. The most heated debates in the 1850s, though, are over the expansion of slavery, and particularly over the expansion of slavery into these newly acquired territories that are west of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers, right? The Kansas-Nebraska Act is one of many pieces of legislation that is an outgrowth of that, and that allows for particularly this newly formed territory of Kansas to consider whether or not it would allow slavery through what's called popular sovereignty, through the vote of the people, allow the people living in the state to decide whether or not slavery would be there. Kansas, almost immediately after the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, will descend into its own inter-civil war that leads up to the actual Civil War beginning in 1860, as pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces fight it out. Right? There's voter fraud, there's massacres on both sides. It's bleeding Kansas is a very horrendous time in the history of Kansas. Now, Nebraska is much more sparsely populated. There's very few settlements, European settlements, Euro-American settlements in Nebraska at this time. But Nebraska is basically all the rest of that unoccupied territory finally getting a name. So it's not the territory that we think of as Nebraska today. If you're an American living in 1855, 1856, shortly after the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and you look at a map of the United States, Nebraska is what we would now consider to be Nebraska, the Dakotas, most of Montana, good chunks of Wyoming. Yellowstone National Park was Nebraska. It hadn't been explored yet by Europeans, but it was technically on a map at least part of Nebraska. Glacier National Park was inside of Nebraska, right? So Nebraska had some great spots. Right? But we don't consider those places Nebraska today. But they were on a map for about 10 years. So is it Nebraska? Some of us probably would wish it would be still, right? It'd be nice to have some mountains, right? The Rocky Mountains. So again, these definitions are changing and evolving over time. I want us to move into the other gallery now, though, to kind of continue this conversation forward. So we kind of ended up over there, we were talking about, you know, the creation of Nebraska as a concept, as a territory, as a place where people now understand they live in Nebraska, right? Nebraska, of course, becomes a state about 13 years later, right, in 1867. And so, you know, for that early period, though, in the 1840s and 1850s, 1860s, Nebraska, for most Americans, if they're coming to this place at all, it's a place to get through, right? You're getting through Nebraska on your way to somewhere else. Settlement in Nebraska is going to come just a little bit later, and it's going to come in large part as a result of the passage of the Homestead Act in 1863, right? Which provides for 1862-63, which provides for any person to claim land, 160 acres of land, for free, nominally. There's a small filing fee you have to pay, so long as they improve that land over a 5-year period. And if they do improve that land, which can mean putting up a fence, building a barn, building some kind of improvement on the property, they can then own that land in perpetuity, right? That's going to be one of the things that starts driving people into this region. Okay? Now, when we think about Nebraska in this time period of homesteading, we tend to think about white settlers coming in. We tend to think about Americans coming in. And there are, of course, a lot of people coming from the eastern coast to settle in this region and take advantage of the Homestead Act. Oftentimes, third or fourth sons who maybe don't stand to inherit their family's land back east, and the east is kind of all full up and it's hard to find a new farm, a new property, will come west to places like Nebraska looking for land, right? And so we tend to get these kind of depictions of early settlers, like we see here with Elizabeth Dolan's work. And Dolan is a Nebraska artist, born and raised in Tecumseh, Nebraska, studied at UNL, has contributed most famously to Morrill Hall, all sorts of the murals at Morrill Hall, and does this lovely depiction of kind of the spirit of the prairie. But it's a very kind of standard depiction of settlement in this time. Kind of the white woman with the small child. We call this the prairie mother. as we think about kind of historical depictions of kind of white woman with child. The Prairie Madonna is sometimes how you'll hear it referred to as well. But this kind of flattens, oftentimes, how complicated and really diverse and messy this whole settlement thing is. Because it's not just American citizens from the East Coast that are settling in Nebraska. It's, of course, immigrants from Europe as well, who come from a wide and diverse array of countries, mostly Polish and Czech, right? Swedish and German. People who don't consider themselves yet to be American, people who certainly don't necessarily consider themselves yet to be Nebraskan, people who within their first generation at least, and even oftentimes in their second generation, are settling in what we would call ethnic enclaves in Nebraska, settling in communities around like-minded people, right? People who speak the same language and hold the same cultural traditions. And we still have communities today that identify, right, their heritage as being Polish or their heritage as being Czech, right? And many of those communities would have had a newspaper that was in their native tongue, a German newspaper or a Czech newspaper, right? That could continue to foster the speaking of their native language. So how would those folks have identified themselves? Would they have considered themselves Nebraskan, or would they have considered themselves Czech, or would they have considered themselves both, right? It's going to vary from person to person to a certain extent, but it's not as simple as they moved here and then became Nebraskan, right? And many of those communities faced discrimination because of where they came from, right? Those European immigrants who came to Nebraska that had Catholic religious beliefs often faced significant discrimination from native Nebraskans, from people who were born and raised here who were anti-Catholic. There's a very active Ku Klux Klan in Nebraska, and it targets the small African-American population, which we'll talk about in a second, but it's primarily targeting the Catholic population that lives here. People who are immigrants, but happen to be Catholic instead of Protestant. And so to those Nebraskans, those Catholic immigrants aren't Nebraskan, right? And so when we get into this whole question of how do you define Nebraskan, if we leave it up to people, it can get really subjective, and discriminatory beliefs can kind of stick their roots in, right? So we see that happening in this time in Nebraska as well. For example, during World War I, when there is a rise of anti-German sentiment in the United States because the United States is at war with Germany, Nebraska is one of many places that bans the teaching of German in public schools. And so people living in German communities who had been learning both German and English oftentimes in their public schools are now no longer able to learn German, their ancestral tongue. And in fact, there's a very famous court case in Nebraska that happens a few years later in 1920 because of a school teacher in Nebraska who refused to abide by those rules and secretly taught the children German, right? But speaking German in that time period because of anti-immigrant, anti-German sentiment made you not Nebraskan to the government, right? So complicated here. And of course, the settlers who are coming to Nebraska in the late 1800s as well are not all white. There are also African Americans coming out to this region too. And John Johnson, this is a little bit later in the early 1900s, documenting some of the black community in Lincoln. But it's a good example of that. We have, of course, photos of early black homesteading communities as well. So there are exodusters in Kansas who settle in places like Nicodemus, which is now a National Historic Site, formerly enslaved individuals who take advantage of the same Homestead Act that white Americans and immigrants from Europe were taking advantage of to claim land for themselves away from the place where they had been enslaved. And some of those folks are making their way to what is the Nebraska Territory in that time, and they're settling in places like DeWitte, which is up in the northwest, kind of north central part of the state, in Bliss, which is in the northeastern part of the state, in Overton. Not too far from here, there's a black community outside of Overton in the late 1800s, right? And then, of course, in Omaha and Lincoln as well. Yeah?
Could you file a homestead if you were not a U.S. citizen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, there is a small, but not absent, African-American community all throughout the state. Kearney has about 8 or 10 African-American families living here in about 1900 or so. And they too often face discrimination and questions about their kind of Nebraskanness, right? In 1929, there's a race riot in North Platte. An African-American man is accused of killing a police officer, and the white community basically issues an ultimatum telling all of the African-American community to leave town and chases them out of town. The population of North Platte, the black population of North Platte, completely disappears in 1929 because they're forced out, right? So we have fights and arguments all throughout this time period over who is a Nebraskan, right, and who belongs here. Right? Those are reflected here in the art too. Right? These portraits taken between 1910 and 1926 would have been taken around the time of a lot of those debates. These people who were depicted here would have been living the experiences, right, of these debates over who is and is not fully Nebraskan, right? I didn't mention it earlier, but I meant to. Fort Kearny, because we're here in Kearny, is a good example of the microcosm and the kind of complexity and diversity of this place, right? Fort Kearny is established in the 1840s to serve the Overland Trail, right? And it is abolished in about 1872 as the railroad has come through here and there's no longer a need for a military fortification just south of the Platte River. It is, of course, the namesake of our community where we live, right, of Kearny. Fort Kearny is an incredibly diverse place. The 1860 census provides us with a really good glimpse into who was there, who was present at the fort in that time. We know that because of the census, that the vast majority of the soldiers who were stationed at Fort Kearny were born overseas, mostly in Ireland and Germany in that case, right? But born overseas, right? Those who were born in the United States came from almost every state in the country east of here, right? So almost every state in the country was represented among the soldiers at Fort Kearny, as were over 100 soldiers from Ireland and Germany. Alongside them at Fort Kearny were officers from the South in 1860, which is important because those officers brought enslaved Africans with them as domestic servants. There were at least 8 enslaved individuals at Fort Kearny in 1860. And there were all sorts of really fun questions about the loyalty of the Southern officers in the newspapers at the time. After the war breaks out, most of those Union troops are sent east to fight in the Civil War, right? And so the troops that were stationed there have to be replaced with someone else, and they're replaced with what are called galvanized Yankees, former Southerners who were captured during the war, and rather than stay in POW camps, agree to fight against Native people for the United States to get themselves out of the POW camps, right? And even around that same time, in 1863, 1864, we see the establishment of what are called the Pawnee Scouts, a group of Pawnee men, warriors for the Pawnee Nation, who ally themselves with the United States government against more traditional enemies of their own, and wear U.S. military uniforms and are outfitted by the United States military and are briefly stationed around Fort Kearny before going further west into Wyoming, right? So even just taking that one little community down just south of here, we have immigrants from around the world, including India, mostly Ireland and Germany. We have people from every state, almost every state in the Union, including Southerners. We have enslaved individuals. We have Pawnee Scouts. We have a whole smorgasbord of people who live in Nebraska, right? And we could maybe consider them Nebraskan. Right? So from there, we're going to go back over into the other room and talk about kind of the consequences of settlement for this definition. By the late 1800s, then, we've got this massive influx of people who are no longer just passing through what we now call Nebraska, but are settling here in places like Kearny, right? And that is going to have consequences for a whole number of groups of people, of course, primarily for the native communities who, again, have lived here for generations and continue to live here. And we see some of that reflected in the art in this space, right? Native nations in Nebraska, like in much of the country in the West, are subject first to the reservation system, where they are forcibly, oftentimes under duress, ceding land away to the United States until they're living on smaller and smaller, quote-unquote, reservations, reservations to which they are oftentimes promised, on which they are oftentimes promised annuities, payments from the federal government, sometimes food from the federal government. Oftentimes those annuities don't come through, but those are the promises that are made and then broken. That reservation system gets modified slightly in the 1880s with the creation of what's known as the allotment system, where those reservations are divided up into smaller allotments that are then given to individual native peoples rather than communities as a whole. Those allotments are 160 acres as well, just like homesteads, because the allotments were designed to turn native peoples into traditional American farmers, right? By the time you get to the 1880s, the goal of the federal government is often to assimilate Native peoples into American culture, which means breaking them of their traditional cultural practices and beliefs. So communal land ownership is one of those things that is targeted, and instead we create allotments where individual Native people become farmers, owning small plots of land and farming that land. That has the dual effect of shrinking the amount of land that is in the control of Native peoples even further, because the way the allotment system works is you take a somewhat large reservation, you divide it up into 160-acre plots, you disperse those 160-acre plots out to individual indigenous peoples who are part of that community, and any land that is surplus, right, any land that is not able to be distributed because you've run out of people to distribute it to, is now open to anybody else to settle, right? Open to white settlement primarily. And so further land is lost for Native peoples through the allotment program. And then we have the boarding school program that is created on top of that. And Angel Decorah is one of the artists in the collection who a bit later in time is forced into a boarding school. Angel Decorah is a member of the Ho-Chunk or Winnebago Nation, which is again complicated because those are people who do not necessarily trace their traditional roots to Nebraska. They're primarily from Wisconsin, but were forcibly relocated here to a reservation, right? And Angel Decorah's descendant of those people is forced to a boarding school when she's 12 years old. She's sent to Hampton, Virginia, right? Separated from her family. Those boarding schools typically did everything within their power to try to dislocate indigenous peoples from their culture. So that means sometimes changing their name, making it more English, right? Changing their hairstyle and their clothing, having the boys dress in suits and the girls in traditional dresses, Western dresses, right? Forbidding the speaking of their native tongue and physically punishing children who continue to try to speak in their native tongue, forbidding the continued practice of religious traditions and forcing the children to embrace whatever denomination of Christianity that particular boarding school is associated with, because they're often run by different Christian denominations. In Nebraska, we have several boarding schools as well. There's Genoa in Nance County, which is primarily for the Pawnee. Nance County was the Pawnee Reservation. Santee up in the northeastern part of the state for the Ponca. There's Santee boarding school as well. But many children are forced to leave the state entirely, to be sent away from their families, which is an intentional strategy to remove them from their cultural home and from their community. And Angel Decorah is one of those. Jackie Stevens, whose Pottery Bowl over there, is another. She's from the Ho-Chunk Winnebago Nation as well, and was sent to boarding school in South Dakota, later to Haskell in Kansas, right? So again, questions over kind of Nebraskanness and Americanness are complicated here. In that time period, in the 1880s and into the early 1900s, indigenous people are not American citizens. They're not able to be American citizens until 1924. And whether or not you were American enough was contingent upon how much of your native culture you absolved yourself of, right? So whether you were Nebraskan enough, also arguably kind of contingent upon how much of your native culture you were willing to give up, right? Angel Decorah's art, coming a little bit later, is a good example of an individual who pushed back against this system, and there are several of those, of course, throughout the history of boarding schools. Individuals who lived through and survived this system, but in her case, started creating art that highlighted the resilience of Native peoples and Native cultures, in particular Native women for her, right? So we, of course, see Native people pushing back against this. Most famously in Nebraska's history, we got Standing Bear, right? Ponca chief who's forced to move to Oklahoma and who comes back to Nebraska to rebury his son, or to bury his son when the son dies, and ends up having to go to court over this, winning the first court case to recognize some degree of civil rights for Native Americans in 1879. But heated debates over whether or not Native peoples are American or Nebraskan in this time period, right? Some major consequences of settlement for indigenous peoples and indigenous artists, speaking to that through the art in the collections here. We also have others who, in this early 1900s time period, choose to leave the state. Outmigration becomes a big issue. The vast majority of homesteaders, despite our kind of popular consciousness, fail. Most homesteaders don't work out. 5 years, 160 acres, middle of sandhills, not a good idea. Doesn't work out for most people. Fun fact, proportionally, women are more likely to be successful as homesteaders than men. Far fewer women are homesteaders, but proportionally women are more successful than men when we look at the overall kind of statistics there. But in either case, both women and men, more than 50% of homesteaders fail to prove their claims and leave, right? Don't stay. So they all leave the state, right? And Nebraska is pretty quickly changing. In the early 1900s, Nebraska is becoming more urban. By 1940, 1950, more than half of Nebraskans will live in urban places. We think of ourselves as a rural state, but it's been almost 80 years since we were primarily a rural state. We're primarily an urban state. Like most states in the country, we're a little later than the average. The average is about 1920 when that flip happens from rural to urban, but we come along eventually too, right? And so a lot of our Nebraska cultural icons from this period are people who are here for a little while and leave, right? So we've got Ruth Waddy's work. Ruth is born in Lincoln and at 4 years old leaves Nebraska and goes on to start the Black Arts Movement in California, right? But is born here. And we said earlier, born here means you're a Nebraskan. So born here and is a Nebraskan, right? Famously behind me, we've got Robert Henry, right? Robert Henry, born in Ohio, but we don't think of him as Ohioan, right? Born in Ohio. His family moves to establish Cozad, just west of here, right? Where his father gets in an altercation with a rancher, kills the rancher, and they have to leave town and change their name, right? Robert Henry dies with nobody thinking of him as a Nebraskan because it's a secret. We don't learn that he's a Nebraskan until 30 years after his death. And now he's got one of the most iconic pieces of Mona art up on the wall, right? But when he died, nobody in Nebraska really thought of him as a Nebraskan, right? And this is doubly ironic because it's a painting of Eula B. Dix, who briefly lived in Beatrice, Nebraska, but was more famous for things elsewhere. So the most iconic painting in Mona's collection, that's been kind of the image of Mona for a long time, is by a former Nebraskan of a former Nebraskan, both of whom we claim as Nebraskan. Right? It's complicated. Right? So this is really classic, right? Henry's not the only one, right? Willa Cather, born in Red Cloud, obviously literary, not art, but born in Red Cloud, goes to UNL and then leaves, but spends much of her life writing about Nebraska, right? Paul Swan, some of whose material is here at Mona, born in Crab Orchard, Nebraska, right? Goes on to be on the silver screen, become branded as the most beautiful man in the world, but left Crab Orchard because he considered it too orthodox for his identity. He was queer, considered it too conservative, too orthodox for his identity, and so left, right? So there's kind of an irony here that a lot of the most famous Nebraskans from this time period are people who left the state, but were influenced by it, right? So we talked about that as being a part of our identity too. Maybe you don't have to live here anymore, but Willa Cather is very much so a Nebraska author, even though most of what she wrote about was done elsewhere. We claim Henry, even though we didn't know that we should have when he was alive, right? All right, we're going to finish up over in the next room, kind of bringing the story to the present. Yeah, editor's note, courtesy of Chuck, because I misspoke. Cather was born in Virginia, then lived in Red Cloud for much of her childhood before.
Virginia's still the only state that does not consider her a Nebraska right.
There you go. So again, we can argue about this stuff. All right, so I kind of want to wrap up in here because I really want to highlight the increasing broadening of this definition that is reflected in Mona's collections and I think reflected a little bit in our culture as well. And there's several pieces of work here that I think we can all see from this space that really reflect that. We just left the room, but you can still see it at the end of the hall where Barbara Takanaka's work is. And Takanaka is born and raised in North Platte as a Japanese American. And is a member of a community that we often forget about, having been in Nebraska back into the 1900s, and that's the Japanese communities in places like North Platte and Hershey and Scotts Bluff. Scotts Bluff has done a pretty good job recently of trying to recognize the history of this particular community, especially through the preservation of the Japanese Hall there, which is a major cultural icon of the historical Japanese community. North Platte had a vibrant Japanese community up through and including into World War II. Barbara Takanaka is from that community. So there is a decent population of Japanese folks living and creating art in Nebraska for over 100 years. One of my favorite stories that Dr. Tai, who some of you saw speak earlier, helped to dredge up is of the Korean students who went to places like UNK, what is now UNK, back then was the normal school, and to Hastings College, kind of expatriate Koreans who were opposed to Japanese rule in Korea and were using their time here in Nebraska to try to organize the overthrow of the Japanese government in Korea. So there's interesting stories there, right? Behind us over here we have this cornucopia by Nancy Friedemann Sanchez, who is of Colombian ancestry and one of many people of Central or South American heritage who has come to Nebraska and lives here now and creates art here now. We also have around me here art created by other members of the African American community who have been part of Nebraska in one form or another. We have Wanda Ewing, who's born in Omaha, who teaches at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, becomes the first tenured African American faculty member at UNO. We have Aaron Douglas, who went to UNL for a while before becoming a leading figure in the Harlem Renaissance in New York City, right? We have William Artis, who was also a member of the Harlem Renaissance, who was from North Carolina, whose family migrated as part of the Great Migration to New York City, but then who himself kind of was called out here and worked for over a decade at Chadron State, right? So we see increasing diversification of the kinds of people who are in Nebraska and who are creating art in Nebraska, represented in this section of the exhibit as well. And that continues to, and I know it's not part of the permanent collection, but I do want to point out to these wonderful photographs in the temporary exhibit space by an Iraqi refugee, right? Because Nebraska in the last 30 years or so has become a major home to refugees from all sorts of parts of the world, including Somalia and Sudan and Afghanistan and Iraq, and most recently Ukraine, and those folks are also living here and creating art. And so as we think about this question of who is a Nebraskan and how it has changed over time, right? When does a refugee become a Nebraskan and belong in the Museum of Nebraska Art, right? When does a settler become a Nebraskan and belong in the Museum of Nebraska Art? All of these are actually quite complex questions and a little more subjective than they seem at face value, which is one of the things I'm hoping this whole talk is kind of communicated. To a certain extent, the answer to the question of how do we become a Nebraskan, it's up to us as a community to decide, which is both great and troubling, because sometimes we decide that people don't count, and we've done that historically, and sometimes we decide that people do. And those are choices that we get to make as people, as a community, right? So that's the challenge of answering this question of who is a Nebraskan, how do we become one? So thank you all for coming and enjoying the talk. And, yeah.